BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Tom Sutcliffe, and this is Start the Week from BBC Radio 4. Hope you enjoy the programme. Hello. That old adage that the first generation makes the fortune, the second maintains it, and the third blows it is only a rough approximation of the truth, as today's guests can testify in different ways. Joseph Sassoon tells the story of his own family in his book The Global Merchants, about a great trading dynasty who managed to hold on to their wealth for a little longer than that before eventually losing it. It is a tale of opportunity and risk and global mobility, themes that run through today's programme. Also with us is the writer Pankaj Mishra, whose novel Run and Hide follows the rising and falling fortunes of three ambitious young men who first meet at one of India's prestigious institutes of technology and then pursue very different visions of success in India and beyond. And the economist Susan Newman is here as well to talk about the winners and the losers of crisis capitalism. No spoilers, but it isn't the billionaires or the bankers who've been having a hard time of it. We start, though, not with our globalised world, but with that of David Sassoon, a refugee from political turbulence in Baghdad, who decided sometime in 1830 to build a new life in Bombay. Joseph Sassoon, your book, The Global Merchants, starts with that move away from Baghdad. David Sassoon had no choice about leaving Baghdad. He had to, but he had a choice about where he went next. Why did he choose Bombay, and how important was that in the fortunes of the family?
Thank you, Tom, for having me. I think it's really interesting because, as you point out, he did have the opportunities to go to other places in the Gulf where other Baghdadi merchants have settled. But while in Bushehr in Iran, where he escaped to, he started meeting traders who were coming from Bombay at the time and who worked also at the East India Corporation, and were telling him that one of the great things about India that no one cares about religion or identity, and therefore he can go there and start a new life. And he did, which was really remarkable considering that he didn't know anyone in India or in Bombay.
He wasn't fleeing from religious intolerance, was he? His father, Sheikh Sassoon, had been a significant figure in Baghdad, and it was a political upheaval that led to the movement of the family.
That is absolutely correct. And this has been one of the myths that through the archives was, hopefully be corrected. They did not escape because of anti-Semitism or anything like that. They were a very prominent family. And they left because of a corrupt governor. And in a way, it's not a story. The story becomes in the book. It's really being so prominent, riches to rags, to riches to decline, almost 4 levels of up and down during that period.
You write in the book, they felt at home wherever they settled, despite being a minority in terms of both religion and their migrant status. How did they manage that trick of being at home wherever they settled?
One of the things that in this Global Merchants in the book that really is absolutely stunning is over a period of almost 100 years of archives, there is never a question whether to deal with a trader or not to deal with a trader because of religion or identity or sect. Always the issue, can we trust the counterpart? And to me, that is really incredible and shows the real globalization of that period with the openness that existed. But at the same time, the ability to straddle all these cultures and languages gave them the possibility to feel at home wherever they were.
And in a sense, they also took this intense sense of family with them, didn't they, as well? I mean, the archives, we should say, are not open to all because so many of them are written in a unique Baghdadi Jewish dialect,
yes,
which you can read, but which the Sassoons' competitors couldn't read, and that was quite important at the time.
That was one of the advantages they really had in their business, because messages used to be about 3 weeks at the time, and people sold information to competitors. but then you could not decode their messages. And definitely it gave them a big plus, an advantage.
You mentioned that moment of increasing globalization. I wonder if you could describe that historical shift a little. Was it a change in the scale of international trade, or was it a change in how it was conducted?
I think it's really a combination of a number of factors. It started with the Opium Wars, then the American Civil War really changed the whole face of the trade of the cotton, then the opening of the Suez Canal, the technology of new vessels, the telegraph. It's almost a combination of all these things taking place in about 3-4 decades that changed everything throughout that period.
So we've got David Sassoon to Bombay. I mean, let's get to the nitty-gritty. How does he make his money once he's there?
Well, it's interesting because there really was not a one thing or one trade. He started from a very, very low base. He did not have any trading experience because, as you pointed out at the beginning, his father and he himself worked for the Ottoman Emperor. And there was really nothing apart from the contact. He would hang around near the cotton exchange and learn about news. He learned at a very early age, and because of his background, how important international news. And he was reading or hearing about how, the seasons of cotton is changing, whether it's in America, and how it was affecting the prices. And so he really started, and even to the end of the 1840s, he was really nowhere in the annals of trade in Bombay.
Starting quite small, with
quite small
and quite risk-averse as well.
And very risk-averse. And then he takes it step by step. But this combination of all the other factors definitely helped him proceed. Once the cotton prices quadrupled as a result of the war, that changed everything. The opium becomes a legal commodity after the two wars. And of course, opium was the cornerstone of the British project in India. And
you write, I've tried to avoid passing moral judgment about their dealings in opium. Why? Isn't that the clearest case of predatory capitalism?
I think that you really need to think about it. I mean, first of all, let me say I do not condone it in the book. I have been very clear, especially towards the end of the 19th century when the effects of the opium becoming clear. But you really have to see it in the historical context. And as a historian, I felt I have to present the good and the bad. And part of that contest is not only it was a project that existed 100 years before they arrived. There was the East India Corporation that was trading almost 100 years before they arrived. The first 20 years of their presence in Bombay, they really were very, very small traders. But also you have to look at what was happening. Even at the end of the 19th century, when it was very clear about all this effect, the British government creates a commission of inquiry, and for 5 years, this Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry investigates, interviews thousands of people, including medical workers, publishes 7 volumes of reports, and the conclusion is that the gloomy descriptions of the moral and the physical degradation caused by opium is very exaggerated and is not accepted.
I mean, one would have to say they would say that, wouldn't they? Because there was an immense amount of money involved in it. You talk about the balance of good and bad. I mean, the good was exclusively, wasn't it, to those trading in opium? Because the opium trade caused problems both at the growing end in India for those growing it, who found themselves in a kind of debt slavery to create it. And then it created enormous problems in China with addiction.
Correct. All of that is absolutely true. But at the same time, this notion that this commodity existed for 5,000 years before, it doesn't change the overall picture.
I mean, the interesting thing is it was, of course, legal to buy opium in England. You could go to your local pharmacy.
Or in New York or Paris to go to your pharmacy.
You write about the philanthropy, which starts very early. He writes into every contract 0.25%, and that is not on the profit, is it? That's on the turnover.
It is really, truly an innovative aspect. They did it on every trade, and when you look at their ledger book, which has hundreds and hundreds, it was like a tax, no different from maritime tax or insurance cost. And irrelevant of the trade being profitable or not, they charged that 0.25%, but it ended up at the end of the year a huge amount. And yes, I think they definitely used that philanthropy in an indirect way.
And do you have any sense of whether that was, as it were, a compensation for the trading, a sense of paying back, or was it a sense that in itself was good business?
I think all the above, plus the third factor to what you just mentioned is the religious aspect, that you have to be philanthropic wherever you live, and give back. And I think they, if in India, definitely to schools, to hospitals, that took place, but also to religious institutions and synagogues.
And it was that helped knit them into it. I mean, it got British citizenship, didn't it?
It got them the British citizenship and got them respect from also the local population.
Now, you conclude that Anglicisation eventually stifled the entrepreneurship of the Sassoons. They become great Anglophiles. Why does that stifle the entrepreneurship?
Well, I think part of it is the upper English aristocracy at the time found working, and kind of not acceptable at the time. And I think that the difference between the fourth generation and the first generation is absolutely shocking. Here, the migrant family that came in with nothing was working 12 hours a day for 6 days. And then you shift it to the fourth generation, and they barely worked for 2 hours, 3 hours, and they were spending huge amounts of money on their estates and all their hobbies.
And going to the races. They
turned
up
the
for work
races,
at 11.
They became very good. They owned horse races everywhere, and one of them, Victor Sassoon, won the Derby 4 times, which is, and one thing leads to another.
I want to open it out a little bit, but just before I do that, you have other great dynasties in the book, the Rothschilds, the Tata family, starting at the same time as David Sassoon, still great figures. What is it about those families that has allowed the dynasty to survive to the present
think
day?
the Tatas is really the most interesting case because they were working together and they knew each other. At a very early period, like almost 1870, the Tatas figured out that, cotton and opium is not going to be good in the long run from a business point of view, and they should shift to industrializations. The Sassoons really did not see that and continued with the old products rather than renovating. They tried, and of course they ended up owning a lot of mills in India towards World War I. But it was a little bit late and not enough.
Yeah, they weren't moving fast enough. Pankaj Mishra.
I think it's a fascinating story because there were a whole lot of, I think, what the Portuguese used to call comprador elites. Across
the compradors are the traders who help
the traders,
you.
Essentially people helping the trading networks of empire, often sort of middlemen. I mean, in this case, obviously, people who were much more than middlemen. And the Parsis in India, another instance of a wealthy, tiny minority who were also intensely Anglophilic. With sort of great fascination for English customs or sort of English rituals, like Henley and the Derby. And I think, of course, what distinguishes the Parsis, and especially the Tatars from the Sassoons, is that, they did diversify early on. And after India's independence, went into all kinds of areas. And as a result, have remained sort of international players. Whereas when you think about all the other comprador elites in places like Egypt or Baghdad, Shanghai, they suffered a very different fate.
Yes. I mean, the Anglophilia is very interesting, isn't it? It's very interesting that Thomas Macaulay makes the decision to make English the official language of India, and that cements a whole sort of set of networks and contacts.
But also one thing to keep in mind, I mean, as a refugee family arriving in Bombay, you want to identify with the most powerful entity, and that is the British Empire, as a natural way of survival.
Yes, but also that business of being a refugee, you say, once a refugee, always a refugee. There's
Correct.
that notion in the back of your mind. Susan Newman, I wanted to ask you, are there similarities, in your view, as an economist, between the opium trade in the 19th century and the coffee trade, say, now? I mean, a drug commodity, hugely valuable commodity traded with real consequences for the people growing it. Are there similarities, or is that a ridiculous comparison?
Thanks for having me on. And I think there are certainly similarities, and we can draw those comparisons across any kind of lucrative commodity that is the subject of global trade. I think what's really interesting about opium and also cotton in Joseph's book is, Joseph very clearly shows us how the Sassoon family's interests were very much aligned with that of British colonialism, which itself was serving the interests of the emerging British capitalist class. And we have something very similar today. I mean, still, the trade of coffee or cotton is extremely concentrated. We have a very small handful of international trading corporations that control the vast majority of these. And whilst we are no longer under this kind of colonial setup or these colonial institutions, there are new institutions set up that do support this kind of now transnationalist capitalist interests that are represented by commodity trading, such as the World Trade Organization, OECD and World Bank, that really do facilitate this in their institutional governance.
And do you sense, reading Joseph's book, that this is the moment that globalization starts? It starts with empire, essentially, and with the extension of empire.
I think it absolutely does. I mean, empire precedes this globalization, industrial development. I think globalization in earnest, what we understand as globalization right now, I think, in this contemporary period really starts with when mass industrial production through the Industrial Revolution itself is served by the interests of empire. So one example, I think, in Joseph's book is also the transport, rather than just colonial extraction of cotton, for example, or raw cotton, is that in the mid-19th centuries, we start to see sort of foreign direct investment, as it were, machinery is being sent out to India to process this cotton, and the emergence of sort of kind of capitalist production, albeit in very small enclavist parts. I would see that as the sort of aspect of where globalization really begins. And in the current period, we see these sorts of supply chains extended across more national boundaries and across many, many more different types of products and manufacturing as well.
Now, one of the arguments for globalization is that, the rising tide lifts all ships. And there is a sense, if you think manufacturing is going to India, that maybe that's true. But is it true? Does it work in that way, in your view?
Yeah, in my view, absolutely not. I think this sort of trickle-down economics, I think it's been debunked a lot at the moment. I mean, mainstream economists or sort of more kind of neoclassical development economists would see a convergence. Through trade, all countries will converge towards a higher standard of living, higher interest, higher incomes, etc. But what we see is not that. We see a divergence. And let's take commodities as an example again. If we look at commodity dependency, countries that are dependent on commodity exports for foreign earnings, they remain largely in low-income developing countries of the so-called global south. So commodity dependency is still a developing country problem. And
you mean that you're essentially dependent on one kind of product or one kind of crop, and your economy becomes focused in on that to the detriment of other things?
One or two crops, and in part, yes, but also there's an inherent inequality that stems from this kind of trade. Because of technological differences in productivity. In the 1950s, the Brazilian economist Raul Prebisch discusses the long-term declining terms of trade to commodities. So this is, if you're exporting commodities, you need to increase that more and more and more just to maintain the same amount of imports and manufacturing. That's a race to the bottom. That signifies a transfer of these profits and income from the global south to the global north. So it's not just about limiting or lack of diversification, but the types of products that countries are specialising in also affects their ability to kind of climb out of a sort of poverty trap associated with commodity dependency.
That notion that it's not trickle down, is it? It's trickle up. Money follows money, and money accrues to money. It's one of the themes of a television series called The Decade, the Rich One, which you were an advisor on. And there's a character in that, a fund manager. I mean, not Jeremy Corbyn, who also contributes, but a fund manager who says, money will always find its way to money. Why is that? How does that mechanism operate? He's talking about quantitative easing, the huge amount of money put into the economy. And the people who got rich were bankers and hedge fund traders and so on.
Absolutely. I think we have to go back again to sort of the way capitalism works, and that's to do with the way in which production takes place, which is now globalised. So based upon cheap labour in the so-called global south and lower technology, lower productive production. But those who are controlling that are the large corporations, primarily based in the global north, the US and Europe. And this has really been the outcome of a kind of falling profitability in the global north. So rather than investing in factories or production or innovation in the global north, we see more outsourcing, but at the same time, more turning of this money towards finance as a way to make more money. So bypassing, in its sense, the productive capacity or production itself. And this is where the money comes from. So there's more money sloshing around. And what we see, you've just given an example of quantitative easing, we see government policies that are developed in order to, they're there to serve another problem, but a byproduct of that is also to protect the wealth stored in these financial assets, which have become really prominent.
In that film, Nick Clegg says rather ruefully, he sort of acknowledges that quantitative easing didn't achieve what it was intended to achieve and that it had all of these unwanted consequences. And he says, I don't know what else we could have done. I mean, did other countries do different things and did it work?
I think there are other things that can be done. One question is what you do with that money that comes out of the quantitative easing. So I think in the Labour manifesto I think it was 2015 election, talks about a people's QE. So let's use quantitative easing as a way of funding infrastructure and other forms of investment that would increase employment and productivity in the UK. There's ways of doing that. There are other ways of raising money also, such as wealth taxes, other forms of profit taxation. This is very much in the news at the moment with the windfalls that the gas companies are experiencing.
Absolutely. I don't know what you feel about this, Joseph, because you're an economist as well, as an author of your own family history.
I think the issue of really taxation is obviously very important, but it's very, at the time, of course, in the historical, there was no quantitative easing. It was free for all, and you just worked your way through all of that. I think the question is whether governments are by definition efficient in managing money in a way which they are collecting. I mean, in the US, they have collected a lot of money and gave a lot of money, but I don't know where it went.
You say taxation is a solution, but in your book, the Sassoons are vigilant at any increase in taxation and, of course, then use their considerable lobbying power to prevent it happening. Which I'm sure continues today for lobbying everywhere. But absolutely, on cotton, on any product, on profits. And that's really where the connection to the philanthropy comes, in the sense that it opened doors for them with the politicians. Pankaj Mishra, I don't know what happened in India after the 2008 crash. Was there a sort of similar... Or were they in a different position?
They were not that affected by it.
And why was that?
They were not so much a part of the financialization of the global economy at that point. So they were less they were much more protected against these global shocks. But I also want to say that, globalization, we sort of tend to think of it as something that starts in the 19th century, late 19th century. And I think it's important to see it as being conducted initially under the auspices of European imperialism. And of course, in the present moment, under the auspices of essentially Western global power. And so in both instances, it starts off on a very uneven field and makes it even more uneven. There's another instance of globalization when you think about in the web of trade networks, mercantile networks that the Chinese established, the Indians established, before the Europeans arrived on the scene, across Asia. Indian families going to what is now Indonesia, setting up, networks there in Java. There's a lot of scholarship now on those early modes of globalization. In fact, what a lot of European traders did when they arrived in Asia was build on those networks of globalization that had been set up by the Indians and the Chinese and people from elsewhere. I mean, they were reached as far as Africa. Without the help of modern technology. So I think this is a different phase of globalization we are looking at here.
And are we not looking at a reversal of some of these power? I mean, the Tata family now owns some very big British firms.
They do.
And the Chinese
absolutely. They own the Pierre Hotel in America. These are very consciously attempts to build an international image, to be seen as an international player. And this has become very important in India in the last 20, 30 years, the period my novel covers. This whole sort of attempt to project yourself as an international superpower. And so all these acquisitions, they might not make much sense in financially, but I think in terms of status and the kind of image they create for you, they seem to be worth it for these people.
Susan Newman, you do a lot of work on the wealth gap, and we're seeing the wealth gap increase, and we've seen it increase both through the 2008 crash and then now in the pandemic. Why has the pandemic had the same effect of making the rich even richer and the poor poorer? Why is that? What is the mechanism behind that?
I think the pandemic has exacerbated or sped up something that's already been underlying. The pandemic did not cause this increasing inequality, but what's been happening before that. I think it was really interesting what Pankaj just said about the Tata family and its sort of global reach. And I think it's really important to separate the corporations and the dynasties and the conglomerates from the nation state to a certain extent. Because actually, whilst they're an Indian company, where do they store their wealth? In what forms? Is this going back to greater investment in India? And I would say actually the interest across this transnational capitalist class is now much more around kind of holding wealth in real estate, in financial assets that are themselves created through new legislation and legal arrangements. They are going to tax havens, they're maintained in that manner. Or into
us with only this morning there was another sort of information dump about Swiss banks and money sort of sequestered offshore, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's related in a way, this current thirst for profit, because profitability rates have been falling over in the longer term. So this thirst to extract as much as possible, either by investing less, placing much more into the financial institutions that serve this wealth accumulation, as well as reducing the amount of investment. We've got a massive investment crisis really in the UK. Real investment I'm talking about, not the financial asset type of investment. And I think this is what's been creating this separation, this kind of widening of the wealth and income gap. And the pandemic has exacerbated that because because of the kinds of policies that are put in place that maintain that wealth. Look at the importance of this stuff. Look at the first high street shop to open that was non-essential after the first lockdown were estate agents.
House prices have jumped over the last month more than in the last 20 years, I read this morning in the newspaper. Joseph,
while everything is correct, and I agree, I think also we have to see about the ambiguities of globalization, about the positive aspects in the sense of refugee families. Even today, I mean, migrant families that have opportunities. The fact is, in this book, you see suddenly the rise of a global CEO woman, which was unheard of in the 19th century.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think, of course it had a lot of adverse consequences, the globalization, but it also had the possibility of giving opportunities to a lot of other people.
Pankaj, do you recognise that there are kind of benefits to globalization?
Oh,
as well?
absolutely.
It's the
I
thing
think,
you've
the characters in my novel are very much beneficiaries of this process that we call globalization. It has offered them previously unimaginable opportunities for personal growth, for personal fulfillment, lifting themselves out of, really degrading, humiliating poverty and destitution. Opened up the world like never before. And these are people, really trapped in very cruel social hierarchies, not just of class, but you have to remember also of caste in India, which is a particularly oppressive force. So globalization helps them break out of this, life of humiliation that their ancestors have suffered for literally centuries. So it has been really, in that sense, a massive opportunity. But then I think, as a novelist, you have to go further. You have to see in what ways this project of personal fulfillment is actually being pursued, or whether it is bringing fulfillment, or is it also bringing a sense of loss for what has been overcome, the past that has been overthrown.
And the consequences for the society those
the consequences
people are building.
Indeed of the new inequalities that emerge within these societies.
You begin your novel at the Indian Institutes of Technology, this elite school. Why did you want to start it there?
Well, if you look at some of the senior executives today in hedge funds, banks across Europe and America, tech companies, Silicon Valley, so many of them are occupied by Indians with this kind of background who've gone to these Institute of Technologies in India, and then went to the US or went to the UK, did some other degree there, joined hedge funds or banks or tech companies at the early phase, and worked their way through those companies very rapidly. And now many of them head those companies. And this is a journey.
And it is a way, isn't it, for a bright but poor.
When I was growing up in India, that was the only way. That was the portal to the world's richness. If you got into IIT, and the effort to get into the IIT started when you were 12, so you destroyed your childhood, you set away sports, you set away everything that a child does, you sat in front of your books, of your textbooks, you did your coaching classes year after year after year.
And your family would have to scrape together the money.
Family would have to scrape together the money to send you to these coaching classes. The reason why you undertook this sort of soul-crushing effort was because you were guaranteed a life of stability, if not prosperity, once you got to the IIT. So this is a project that literally, millions of people have undertaken in the last 3-4 decades.
Your central character, Arun, the narrator, he comes from a very poor background, but he can pass as Brahmin because his father has just literally changed his name on the certificate. Why is he the narrator? Because you've got a lot of characters. You've got Alia, who is a woman he's had an affair with and is writing a book, and the whole book is addressed to her. You've got Asim, who is this would be a very unreliable narrator. He's a sort of self-invented man, a kind of literary figure. And then Virendra, who's an untouchable, a Dalit, who becomes a Silicon Valley billionaire. So why did you think, right, I want to go with Arun as the main voice?
Well, I wanted someone who is able to observe this particular world, the world that promises, unimaginable richness, but at the same time is not really part of it or doesn't wish to be part of it because temperamentally he's very different. He's been marked by this sort of, destruction of his childhood, this enormous pressure put on him by his father to succeed. And then he realizes that he actually doesn't want to be part of this world. Whereas he's very happy translating Hindi literary fiction into English. And, I've met people like that who've gone to these institutions and then decided this life was not for them. And I've also met people who are in very senior positions in banking and hedge funds and then say, I wish I could have, done painting. I wish I could have written novels, because obviously they were talented. They had this urge and they suppressed it in order to, basically find a life where they don't have to worry about money. So I thought of Arun as this character who can observe this whole sort of rising out of poverty into prosperity and be able to observe it, but not with a kind of moralistic point of view. But, as someone who is very much part of that world of poverty and destitution and can see why people want to get out of it, but he's also marginal to it in many ways.
He represents a strain in Indian thinking, which is, as it were, surrendering the world and choosing asceticism and instead of wealth. Asim, on the other hand, he quotes V.S. Naipaul at one point. The world is what it is. Men who are nothing, who allow themselves to become nothing, have no place in it. He's a much better writer than Ayn Rand, but that is a very Ayn Randian notion, isn't it?
It's a very bleak idea. It's a very bleak idea because it simply assumes that you are nothing if you don't allow yourself to become something. It doesn't really see any kind of merit in any other sort of life. And it basically, what it asks you to do is to trample upon your past, is to disown your past, disown your parents who are not as educated and sophisticated as you want to be, who speak English or who speak Hindi with an accent you're ashamed of. So it involves disowning your past in all kinds of crucial ways. It involves becoming something else altogether. It involves a kind of self-betrayal and confusion. And this is what I really wanted to dramatize in this novel.
You've written non-fiction and essays about these same subjects, about kind of the direction of India and so on. What did the novel let you do that those other forms don't?
Oh, a lot. I think, the fact is that you can enter the inner life of characters in a piece, in a work of imaginative prose, in a way you can never do it in nonfiction. Here we have, for instance, in Joseph's book, the account of David arriving in Bombay. It's only through fiction that you can imagine how he responded to his new world, what memories he took with him of the Baghdad he left behind, what were his feelings of loss, what were his new adventures like in Bombay. And you can describe superficially, of course, that he met this person, then he fell in love, or he married. But what was going on in his head, all of that can really only be accessed through fiction.
Do you agree, Joseph, or did you find those details in the archive?
Absolutely, because no, you don't. And that's part of the problem of any historian. You're looking at archives, but you don't have the personalities. If I may, one thing about the past. In a way, your question about, the Anglicization, I think it was trying to delete the past. By the fourth generation, they didn't want to know that they came from the Orient, from Baghdad, but rather that originally maybe Europeans.
There is
Spain.
a wonderful picture in your book of Arthur and I think James, sort of third generation.
Yes.
Dressed for fancy dress in England in the most luxurious Oriental gear. Now, that seems to me to suggest a real confidence. It's a novelist's detail, that, isn't it? That they would feel confident enough to go out fancy dress as their past identity.
Maybe only in the fancy dress, but not in reality.
Is there ironically, a freedom in the novel that it's less susceptible to the shout of fake news? Because that's off the table. And you write about very volatile things here. Hindu nationalism, which have got you, sort of made noise when you write about them as essays. Do you have a greater freedom there in the sense that...
Oh, much more so. I think it allows you to explore all kinds of mindsets and outlooks and worldviews without any kind of judgment involved, and which is the kind of judgment you have to make when you write nonfiction. You have to come down on one side or other. Whereas fiction is a far more democratic space. You can bring people of all kinds of views into conversation with each other without coming down on one side or other. And, also explore things which are very difficult to do in nonfiction. For instance, we've had for the last, several years now this discourse about the losers of history, victims of historical injustices, victims of imperialism. And, much of this discourse is extremely welcome, but I think it's important to also explore what happens when the losers of history also then become the winners of history. What happens when someone who's born right at the bottom of the social hierarchy rises to the top of it? Is that person also going to turn into an oppressor? the oppressed, the person who was oppressed yesterday. So these are questions you cannot really explore in non-fiction without entering into a very intensely polemical arena. Where you'll be stigmatized or branded with one, a sort of prejudice or another. Whereas in fiction, you can't truly explore these scenarios.
I want to finish, because we're running out of time now, just by asking all of you about the thing that's hovered over this a little bit, which is this connection between globalism and populism now. What is the connection there, and why is it the case that right-wing populism seems to have mobilised that anti-globalism much more effectively than the left? I don't know whether you have a view on that.
Well, I mean, I think, the assertion of nationalism today, whether in Brexit, through Brexit or through Hindu nationalism, is essentially a revolt against the kind of globalism that we've seen over the last 2-3 decades.
Against the Lutyens elite in your book.
Against the elites that have benefited very narrowly from globalization.
Yeah. Susan Newman?
I also think this globalization we're talking about has created this contemporary capital, created the inequalities that we've seen, and it's really hollowed out the middle. I mean, Pankaj's characters have very, reflected capitalism in their choice of career in tech and in finance. The aspirations of the poor are not to be doctors or university lecturers or teachers for whom wages have been stagnant. I mean, UCU lecturers are currently out on strike on overpay and conditions. And I think there is this hollowing out that's created through these kind of the sort of centrality of profit and wealth in finance.
OK, well, we have to leave it there, unfortunately, because we've run out of time. But thank you to all of my guests. Professor Susan Newman, Head of Economics at the Open University, Joseph Sassoon's History of the Sassoon Dynasty, The Global Merchants, and Pankaj Mishra's Run and Hide are both published later this week. Many thanks to today's studio engineer, John Boland. Next week, Helen Lewis is going to be here talking to Peter Hennessy about the need for a new beverage report post-COVID. That's on point as well, isn't it? But for now, thank you and goodbye. Thanks for listening to this edition of Start the Week on BBC Radio 4, produced by Katie Hickman. And if you're after more conversations on art, science, history and politics, you can find many, many more on the BBC Sounds website.